segment is sponsored by Wine Time Radio. Every Saturday at 5 p.m. on AM 560, explore the wonderful world of wine with host James Crooker and Rob Lehner.
This is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560. The Answer.
Good morning, Dan, and in for Amy this morning, Chicago Tribune editorial board member Kristen McQuarrie. And Kristen, thanks for joining us again. And speaking of editorials, did the AFL-CIO also buy cranes yesterday?
Perhaps.
Because you directed my attention to this very compelling Mike Madigan op-ed, excuse me.
Mm-hmm.
Mike Madigan deigning to communicate, which he doesn't do often verbally or in print, and he said, to no one's surprise, the real failure in Illinois, all our problems, Rauner is all about himself partisanship.
Mm-hmm. It's basically what the op-ed. It's not surprising to me because he has in the past, when the Tribune has done, when the news side has written stories about his law firm or this or that, he has responded with these sort of long, stem-winding responses. But yeah, so Cranes runs an op-ed where he walks through how he's the hero in all of this, and it was a bipartisan deal, and that Democrats stand ready to continue making the difficult but necessary decisions because it's clear there's more work to be done, and blaming Rauner.
40 years of heroism. How are we doing?
Right. Yeah, I know. That's what's sort of funny about the piece. He says, according to the governor's own financial experts, without a responsible budget, the Rauner deficit would grow to a staggering $47 billion by 2022. What's the Madigan deficit? Where are we at?
Or debt load, or
right.
unfunded liabilities,
I know.
or tax burdens, or job climate, or state of K through 12 education, or public safety, or prison population, or Medicaid. The stability of the Medicaid program. Where shall I stop?
It's this sort of rhetoric, though, that since 1983, except for the 2 years that Lee Daniels was House Speaker, Mike Madigan signed off on every single budget that moved.
For those acting in furtherance of the left to justify their actions, like those surrender Republicans in Illinois, he does the heartstring sophistry. Thousands of seniors losing access to critical care. Domestic violence shelters have closed their doors. 25,000 workers have been laid off, and so forth. The devastation to social service providers, the problems with our Medicaid program where the intended beneficiaries are actually seeing their access to quality care worsen, those are real. But of course, the conversation is about responsibility. Well, how did those things happen? What are the proximate causes of the deterioration of everything from services to our business climate, to people's home equity, which he didn't mention in here. Not too much about property taxes. I wonder why. But and it seems that there's, I guess, a twofold problem. One is there's very little institutional memory in the body politic. And number two is there's very little institutional memory in the Chicago and Springfield press corps.
Not here.
Present company excluded. I can see the point. But are those? Is that
absolutely? Yes, it's
part of it.
Of course it is. And I mean, he talks about all those domestic violence shelter, and like you said, that is true. The budget gridlock has worsened over the past 2 years because of this impasse and lack of agreement and policy positions that are different. But what about the fact that under Madigan, the state skipped pension payments, skipped making actuarially required pension payments, and so now you have jeopardized the retirements of how many state workers, teachers, university professors, etc.,
including a few 100,000 current beneficiaries, not
sure.
just people looking to retirement, people actually in retirement.
Right. I mean, how the SEC in 2013 basically charged the state with fraud for failing to reveal to bondholders how bad our debt load was.
This is such an underreported and underappreciated story that you're pointing to. What the SEC said specifically, 2005 to 2009, the state fraudulently issued $2.2 billion worth of bonds. But the state apparently issued those bonds itself because no human being was responsible and no disciplinary, much less legal action was taken against those people who set the wheels in motion for the sale of $2.2 billion worth of bonds by the state.
Mm-hmm.
A $2.2 billion fraud. And what does that generate? Shoulder shrug.
Right. Yeah. This was in 2013. They determined that, like you said, from 05 to 09. Who was in charge then of the House and Senate? Who was in charge of the governor's office?
It's so, I mean,
well, let's think.
Kristen, that's so long
Oh,
ago.
gosh, I know.
You're straining the bounds of my memory.
Right.
I believe Madigan was the speaker.
I believe so.
I believe Cullerton was the Senate president.
And these might have. I don't know if these were the same.
Blagojevich was
the governor. Were these the bonds that were part of the $10 billion bond sale that they approved as soon as Blagojevich walked in the door? I'm not sure.
And oh, by the way, that $10 billion bond scheme that Blagojevich engineered, how did that make its way to this part of the discussion where we're talking about the fraud that was committed? Surrender Republicans in the Senate, a few Republicans who flipped and supported the deal. Kirk Dillard.
I don't remember that roll call, but
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean the SEC
just repeats itself over and over again.
Claims that Illinois misled investors about the effect of changes to its funding plan, particularly the pension holidays enacted in 2005. So again,
well, one other thing though too on this, just in terms of the 15 years, round numbers of sorts. 5 is not a round number; it's a crooked number, but you know what I'm saying.
Not yet, but go on, keep talking.
So this century, the 15 years of Democrats having all three branches of government in Illinois featured, among other things, all the abstract financial data we're going over, all the commissions of non-crime crimes.
Mm-hmm.
It also featured Illinois being the worst in the nation in providing services to persons with developmental and intellectual disabilities. So for all of those on the left or the center who buy this heartstring sophistry from Madigan, remember when they had the run of the place, and frankly, they've had the run of the place even with Republican governors, but I can see the point. There's been a lot of complicity by Republican governors, some Republican legislators. But when they had the run of the place, all the taxing and spending, all the borrowing and spending that's been done, $250 billion worth of debt, the largest unfunded pension liabilities, the highest local and state tax burden combined in the nation. We were worst in the nation in providing those services to those vulnerable populations they say they're focused on. And you know how you square the circle on those two realities? They're lying. Imagine that. They're lying. And people buy the lies over and over and over again, particularly people that are well-intentioned and think, like I think, that persons with disabilities through no fault of their own need to be provided services by the state. We should be number one in the nation providing those services. When they had control, when they've had the purse strings uninterrupted, no gnashing back and forth between the executive and the legislative branches, last in the nation. It is a scam, like everything else in this state is a scam run by the Chicago power structure.
Yeah, I mean, I can attest to just being in Springfield for many years during budget talks when Access Living and some of these groups who represent disabled adults would be in Springfield testifying before committees, begging for scraps. Who got served first under every budget under every Democratic budget? State workers, pork projects. You'll recall a couple of years ago, we reported it in the Tribune. I think it was a Ray Long story. Madigan set aside $37 million in Jesse White's budget to hide it so that it could flow directly to his schools. Schools in Madigan's district and to his top lieutenants got to divide up this $37 million a couple of years ago when we're broke. I'm using quotation marks. So that's how state government has operated. And you're right. All of these years, maybe if there was some leftover money and they were done fighting over pork projects, they would throw some scraps to some of these organizations that serve that population.
But to listen to them talk, that's the only reason they're down there. The only reason they're down there is to make sure we have quality social services. Continue to buy this at your peril. Jeff in Mundelein, you're on Chicago's Morning Answer.
Morning.
Morning.
Morning. If this, and I hope it does, Republican health care plan goes through, and they turn it over to the states through Medicaid, boy, what a huge slush fund for Madigan to get his hands on with that, huh?
Well, yeah, thanks for the call, Jeff. I mean, yeah, the block granting, but at least you've changed the incentive structure so that Illinois doesn't get rewarded for recklessly spending more dollars on Medicaid for people that Medicaid was never intended to serve, which is the Obamacare expansion. We were expanding Obamacare before there was Obamacare. Rob Blagojevich, he tried to expand Medicaid up to middle-income households because he wanted to basically create more political fealty.
He did. He and Emil Jones, they expanded. I mean,
that was actually, this is another underreported story. His illegal expansion of Medicaid was actually one of the charges in the impeachment document.
Oh.
Yeah. Go back and look at the impeachment doc. Cassandra in Montrose Beach.
Hello?
Cassandra, you better get a hold of that dog.
I know. I think the media fails. It's not just a failure of memory. The media fails to ask the questions that ought to be asked. Universities want more money. How much do they spend on their capital budgets instead of? How many hours does a professor spend in the classroom? Not 35, I can tell you that. It's not just overpaid public sector workers. It's every alderman having a driver. It's every department head in Chicago having a driver. These people, this state has been run on an organized criminal business model as long as I have lived in it.
Yeah, thanks for the call, Cassandra. Appreciate that. Ed Burke needs a security detail.
I mean, I love those. Those are all good points. I remember a certain Cook County board member coming to visit us at a newspaper where I worked who had several assistants, a driver, and she actually sort of bent down so that her assistant removed her hat for her. She didn't even remove her own hat.
Who's that?
Deborah Sims.
Oh, well, I mean, look, Deborah Sims has a lot on her mind. She can't be remembering to remove her hat all the time, Kristen. She's got the public's business to conduct.
This is exactly to Cassandra's point, though. Even Cook County board members have their own little slush funds where they can spend taxpayer money on car leases, and of course, they're leasing Lexuses and
that. Well, they are our betters, and that is a small price to pay for their guidance in our lives.
Yes. You need to correct my thinking, apparently.
Neil in LaGrange.
Couple things. Look at the way they drew the maps. And look at the 31st district specifically. That district has been totally gerrymandered to protect the incumbent. Heck, the last 6 or 7 election cycles, she's been unopposed every time. But more importantly, look at, 10, 15 years ago, all that money they were spending with First Illinois. Remember that big slush fund?
Yeah, sure. Illinois First. Sure.
Bills were backed up, and they were spending all this money.
Thanks for the call, Neil. And the maps, as I said, everything in Illinois is a scam.